Hey everyone, and welcome back to OntarioCyrptids. I hope you all have had a great week. And I can't believe how fast time flies. Pretty soon, I'll be heading out on the trails here in Ontario. Some of the places I like to hike can be pretty slick in the springtime, so I usually start in the month of May. Today I have 4 interesting encounters to share with you all. We'll be heading to Vermont, Washington, and Idaho. I think you'll find these encounters intriguing. If you have an encounter story that you would like to share, then please forward your stories to OntarioCyrptids@gmail.com. I will be honored to share your story with like-minded people. Now sit back and relax as we begin with today's encounters. In the fall of 1988, we're going to Windham County, Vermont, and the nearest town is Somerset. In the fall of 1998, I went to Somerset, Vermont to go camping along the Somerset River. A forest road runs up an airfield with free dispersed campsites. It was first come, first serve. And in the summertime, it would be packed with kids partying and living their best lives. Still, my girlfriend and I had planned this trip in the fall because the fall leaves in Vermont are something special to see, and we knew the campgrounds would be empty in the middle of the work week during the off-season. I set up our tent and we walked around the woods down to the river and just enjoyed the season's natural beauty. We lay in the tent talking as the sun went down and drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up to 2 voices outside the tent. It sounded like 2 men whispering to each other, but it wasn't in English. I couldn't distinguish what they were saying, but distinctly heard 2 male voices. Suddenly, there was a long, low whistle from off in the distance, and I heard one of the men make a click sound in acknowledgement. Everything was quiet after that. I waited until sunrise and went outside the tent and looked around. I didn't see anyone. My heart was pounding in my chest and I was wide awake. I woke my girlfriend up and we left. I still wonder where those guys came from and why they used whistling and clicking sounds to communicate. The Somerset campground is far off the beaten path, and I didn't hear or see any signs of vehicles. Rural Vermont has a lot of strange legends and folklore. Years after this happened, I learned about the Bennington Triangle and the disappearance of people in the 1950s. I left the state and joined the Army a few months later. I've only been back to Vermont a few times since that, but I've never camped there again. 2014, we're headed to Chittenden and Washington counties, Vermont, and we're going to Camel's Hump Natural Area. Okay, here you go. This is all true and strange. In 2014, I took my first trip to Vermont with my girlfriend at the time. She is my wife now. We were visiting her brother, my now brother-in-law. He lives in Winooski near Burlington. My brother-in-law is a big outdoor guy. One of his main jobs in the summer is to work high ropes courses in the woods. He's lived there for the majority of his life, and on this particular visit, he took us on a 6.5-mile hike up Camel's Hump to the summit and back. We were about 4 to 4.5 miles up. My girlfriend, wife, my brother-in-law, and our dog stopped hiking to take a break to have some water and a snack. I remember having an apple and a sandwich. We were stopped for only 5 to 10 minutes when we hear this crazy loud sound. It was so loud it was like someone revved a Ferrari right next to us. Very deep sound. At first we were in shock. No one moves, including my dog. I even said out loud, "Who's got an engine way up here?" Keep in mind we were 4-something miles up a mountain that needed some hands and feet climbing type of hiking on some rocky formation, so it's not like someone drove a vehicle or an ATV as high up as we were. Where we stopped was right on the cusp of alpine tundra, where the vegetation changes, so needless to say, we were high up there. My brother-in-law says he didn't remember his knife, and we all then think bear or mountain lion. Maybe it's a deep growl. We don't really know. So our choices were to keep going the last 2 miles up the summit and down the other side of the mountain and finish the loop to get back to the car, or turn around and head back down the difficult way we just came, a full 4 to 4.5 more miles. We choose to go to the summit. Everything was fine on the way up, other than being sketched out about what we just heard a couple miles back. We had some water and took some pics and decided to finish the loop to try to beat the sunset and head back down off the mountain and get back to the car. It was going to be dark soon, so we wanted to get back before then. Another hour or so goes by and we are almost in total darkness heading down the mountain. We don't have flashlights because we didn't plan on staying out so late. My brother-in-law had hiked this mountain before, so he suggested he'd run the rest of the way down by himself to get the car and then drive it as far up the trail as he could to pick up my wife, dog, and I to cut off the last mile or so. This trail loop has a long and short version based on where you park. So my brother-in-law takes off running downhill down the trail in the near dark alone as fast as he can while I'm trying not to fall with my dog and wife. The creepy part is that we felt like someone was right behind us the entire way down the mountain. We were out of water and food and had no weapon and on an unfamiliar trail. It was just not a good situation. We aren't sure what we heard or if whatever made the noise was following us, but I'm glad we made it back to the car and found my brother-in-law waiting for us at the bottom. The feeling of being watched and out there in the dark was a terrible feeling. This next one takes place in 2009. We're going to Thurston County, Washington, and the nearest town is Offutt. I'm a former longtime airborne ranger, having served for many years in 275 in Washington State. After my service, I was a Forest Service firefighter and disaster response contractor. Suffice it to say, I'm a very experienced outdoorsman, professionally trained. In 2009, I was hiking in Weyerhaeuser Forest Reserve near Offutt Lake in western Washington State. The preserve was adjacent to the home of a buddy's father, and before setting off into the lumber preserve, his father had implored for me not to go hiking in there alone. It was a very dangerous area, a very frightening area. He had lived there for 30 years and refused to let his kids ever step foot in the forest. Being a young, confident ranger, I laughed off his superstition and headed out into the virgin forest. It was an unusual hot and humid day in late spring, and I was armed with a Glock 19 9mm pistol and feeling very capable and competent. I had made it out about 3 miles into the forest and came into this massive bowl section of perfectly manicured pine trees with no undergrowth, just 10 spruce pine needles bedded as far as the eye could see. It looked like I was stepping down into a forest bowl the size of a modern football stadium. I got about halfway down the bowl and literally every sound in the forest became totally deafening silent. All in an instant, I was All in an instant, it was as though I had stepped into a soundproof studio room in one step. No bugs, no wind, no ambient sound, nothing. By this time, I had been to combat twice and graduated ranger school and was a pretty salted individual, but I'm not ashamed to admit I was overcome with a feeling of fear, dread, and deep guttural paralyzing fear. I gathered myself together and turned around and practically ran the entire way back to the Curtis I gathered myself together and turned around and practically ran the entire way back to Curtis's father's house, got in my truck and left, and never went back. I've spent years thinking about what happened in those woods, and to this day I have no answer. I was completely sober, fully aware of my surroundings, and in good spirits and health at the time of this incident, with no mental, physical, or psychological issues. I cannot say what this incident was caused by, but I have never been so deeply in fear in my life. Even thinking about it now over a decade later makes me feel uneasy, as though whatever was in the forest is still there. All this I swear on my scroll to be true. This is going to be the last story of the day. This one takes place in January of 1902. We're going to Caribou County, Idaho, and the nearest town is Chesterfield, which now would be really a ghost town. My grandpa was born in the last year of the 19th century and spent his entire life living in rural Idaho as a farmer and rancher. He had tons of old cowboy stories he would tell us grandkids. Most of them were funny, some were cautionary, but a few were downright creepy. When my grandpa was 6 years old, he, along with his older brothers and a gang of kids from nearby farms, decided to go ice skating for the day. At that time, my great-grandpa was working as a ranch hand, and the family lived near Chesterfield, Idaho, now mostly a ghost town. It was a bright and sunny January day in 1902, and though the temperature was low, the sun kept things somewhat warm. They had hitched sleighs to their horses and headed down to the Portneuf River to ice skate. There were 8 kids altogether, and they were excited to show off their new skates from Christmas. Along with my grandpa and his brothers, there were the 3 Robinson kids, Tommy Bayer, and the Gooch twins. The best spot to skate was next door to Gooch's ranch. The river there was broad and shallow, so the ice tended to be thicker, and if they did fall through, they would just get their legs wet. The kids spent a couple of hours skating when a loud scream came from a willow bush on the opposite side of the riverbank. The kids could only watch as a giant man, covered head to toe in thick black fur, came lumbering out of the bushes. It was carrying a large tree branch and was screaming in rage at the kids. They fled towards the sleighs, trying to scramble up the riverbank in their skates. My grandpa, being the youngest, was at the back of the rush. He couldn't get a good foothold because of the skates and fell back towards the ice. The giant was now crossing the river towards them, screaming and swinging his branch. My grandpa was sure this creature was going to eat him. As my grandpa tells it, Lady Luck smiled down on me that day by the river, because as the giant was midway through the river, the ice gave way. It only submerged its shins, but was slowed down considerably as it tried to get back on top of the ice. This gave my grandpa's brother enough time to jump down and cut the lace off my grandpa's skates. They left the skates and dashed up the riverbank and jumped onto the sleigh. As they looked back, the giant was crusting the riverbank. To their relief, it didn't chase the sleighs. It just stood there hollering at the kids and swinging his tree branch. The kids were able to make it back to Gooch's ranch, where they told their encounter to John Gooch, the twins' grandfather. Word spread quickly in the tiny farming community, and soon a posse was formed to hunt down the beast. Where the kids had been skating, there they found footprints almost 2 feet in length. My grandpa's skates were found near the tracks. They had both been bent in half like horseshoes. The tracks headed west into the nearby mountains. The posse followed them as far as they could, but deep snow prevented their travel any further. The creature was never sighted in that area again. This story captivated the small community, and soon word traveled across the country of the Idaho Wildman. Here is a link to a newspaper article describing the event. 4th column over, 4th article down. That spring, my great-grandpa decided to buy a ranch in the Little Lost River Valley farther north in Idaho. My grandpa had many other weird and creepy backwoods stories, but he always said that this encounter frightened him the most. He was sure he would have been killed if the giant hadn't broken through the ice and given his brothers a chance to cut his laces. Wow, what terrifying encounter stories we just heard. I cannot imagine being a 6-year-old child seeing this giant wild man chasing me down with a tree branch. What an epic encounter. All of these stories today were fascinating. First, we had the campers hearing talking in some unknown language, followed by this low whistle and clicking sound. Second was the hiker hearing a deep guttural reverberating growl near the summit. And next was the dreadful deafening silence we often hear about. And lastly, this Idaho wild man, so epic that his grandson was able to hear his grandfather's stories. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed these 4 encounters today. If these stories reminded you of an encounter that you would like to share, then please forward your stories to OntarioCyrptids@gmail.com. I would be honored to share your story on this channel. Thank you for listening until the end. I truly appreciate it. Please hit the like button on your way out and smash that subscribe button if you're new to my channel. Have yourselves a great weekend, and I hope to see you all next week right here on OntarioCyrptids.